Hello everyone, welcome back for more human physiology. So our focus last time was all about the endocrine system. So lately we've been talking about cell-to-cell communication in the body, and with the endocrine system we were focused on one particular way of sending long-distance messages in the body. So now that we're through with that, we can move on to the other major way that we send messages over a very long distance in the body using the nervous system. Now, the nervous system is going to contain a little bit of extra terminology, things that we may not be familiar with yet. So let's go ahead and get a handle on that before we really start talking turkey here. So this is a slide that we showed in the communication unit, so basically just letting you know how the nervous system is organized. So we have a central nervous system, which is going to consist of the brain and the spinal cord, and this is going to act as our control centers in both neural and neuroendocrine loops that we've talked about before. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is mostly going to consist of the way that we send afferent and efferent signals through spinal and cranial nerves. These nerves are going to serve to connect the control centers to sensors and control centers to effectors, as we have seen before. And then if we go back to a little bit of what we talked about in Chapter 4, it's not going to be a surprise that most of the nervous system is going to be made up of nervous tissue, which, as we said, contains two major types of cells. We've got the neurons, which we are going to talk about a lot in this chapter. The neurons are the cells that send the electrical information over a very long distance. So these cells fire what are called action potentials that send a message electronically through the axon of one of these neurons, and as we said, it allows for long-distance communication. So here you can see what a neuron looks like structurally. It's got a cell body here where you can see its nucleus and where most of its organelles are going to be located. We've got dendrites, which are going to serve as little antennae that allow the neuron to sense its surroundings if it's a sensory neuron, or to receive messages from somewhere else if it is a other type of neuron. It's got a very long axon, which is going to propagate our action potentials, and then it's got its axon terminal. And then the other type of cell, generally speaking, are called glial cells. There are quite a few different types of glial cells, and we will talk about them later on, but the most important thing that we talked about before is that you need to understand these cells do not actually send electrical messages themselves. They exist totally to take care of the neurons. So if we focus a little bit more on the neuron itself, we said that what makes long-distance communication possible is the fact that the axon of any particular neuron can be very long. So if a nerve is just a big bundle of these axons, nerves can send messages over a very long distance because those axons, as I said, are very long. Now, another thing to see here, and this will serve as a nice preamble to our discussion on glial cells, you'll notice in this picture that the axon is surrounded by kind of this purple substance. Now, it's not actually purple, it's just been colorized purple here for the sake of making it easier to see. So this quote-unquote purple stuff is called the myelin sheath. It's basically like an insulation that surrounds the axon, not unlike the way rubber insulates a lot of our electrical cables. So whether you're talking about the power cord for your TV, the charging cable for your phone, you need insulation in order to get an electrical message to transmit properly. So this myelin sheath is laid down and is actually a part of two different types of glial cells. Oligodendrocytes, if you are talking about the central nervous system, and then the same thing is done in the peripheral nervous system by a different type of cell called a Schwann cell. In this picture here, since this is labeled as an oligodendrocyte, this tells us that this neuron here must be in the central nervous system. So oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells are just two different types of glial cells, and we will talk about others like astrocytes, ependymal cells, and microglia much more fully later on. So one of the most important terminological discussions for us to have is the distinction between white matter and gray matter. I'm sure you've heard of this before, but I want to make sure that you have a very firm understanding of exactly what we mean when we say white matter and gray matter and what those two terms imply. So, when you talk about neuron axons that are myelinated by oligodendrocytes are kind of special. They secrete a special type of myelin that appears white in color. So anytime you see white matter, specifically in the central nervous system, and only the central nervous system, because that's the only place you're going to find oligodendrocytes, anytime you find this white matter or nervous tissue that appears white in color, as you see from this little section of the brain here, what that tells you is that that white matter contains a very high density of myelinated axons, axons that are specifically myelinated by oligodendrocytes. So the regions that do not contain a bunch of this myelin is going to appear gray by contrast. It's not so much that there's something making it appear gray, it just appears gray because by default it is not white. So there's kind of an important distinction here. Any places where you find gray matter, because it is nervous tissue, but since it does not contain the myelin, this tells you that this is where the other parts of the neurons are located, the parts that are not the axons. So gray matter is going to be, generally speaking, where you find cell bodies. So cell bodies of neurons are not myelinated, only the axons are myelinated. So if I trace my pointer here around the gray matter here of what we would call the cerebral cortex, this is where you would find a big collection of cell bodies of neurons, and then the axons of those neurons project out more into the center region of the brain through what is the white matter there, the white matter being the myelinated portions of those same neurons. And then it's an important thing to understand that you will not find white matter in the peripheral nervous system because the myelin that Schwann cells lay down does not appear white in color. This is why I was saying that oligodendrocyte myelin is kind of special. Only it appears white. Schwann cell myelin does not appear white in color, so you will only find this gray matter, white matter distinction in the brain and in the spinal cord. So in these little cartoony figures here, you can kind of see the distinction a little bit better. The way these things are colorized, it doesn't look so much like gray matter as it does kind of fleshy pink matter, but it's gray matter and white matter, right? So in the brain, gray matter is going to be localized mostly to the outermost regions called the cerebral cortex. So this is kind of what we're tracing around here on the outside. So because that is gray matter, it mostly contains cell bodies of neurons. And then the regions contained within is where you find the white matter. So that's going to mostly be myelinated axons that project from the gray matter down towards the brainstem and then up from the brainstem too. It goes in both directions. So in the brain, it's not just the cortex that you find gray matter. You also find localized regions of gray matter called basal nuclei. Again, they are not actually colorized gray here. They're colorized yellow and blue and red here. So just big structures of big structures of cell bodies called nuclei, and we call those basal nuclei. So take a look at the spinal cord here. What do you notice about the organization of white and gray matter in the spinal cord that makes it different than what we see in the brain? Well, the main difference is that with the brain, you find, for the most part, the gray matter on the outside and the white matter on the inside. Well, with the spinal cord, it's flip-flopped, so you mostly find the white matter on the outside and the gray matter in this kind of butterfly-shaped region on the inside. So in the spinal cord, that internal gray matter is mostly going to be just like what we saw before. It's mostly going to be cell bodies of neurons, specifically motor neurons and interneurons, which we will talk about later. And then they are going to project their axons either up through the spinal cord or down through the spinal cord. That's what you're seeing there with the white matter. Or they will project their axons straight out through a spinal nerve to get through to their targets. That's what you're seeing here in red here. You're seeing the cell body of a motor neuron with this little red circle here, and then its axon projects out through a spinal nerve to go to its target. So let's talk a little more terminology here, words that we're going to use that we need to make sure that we understand so that we can use them properly. There's two structures that you find all throughout the nervous system that we need to be aware of, but as you're going to see here, the possibly inconvenient thing for us is that we change what word we use depending on where in the nervous system that we are located. So first, a local congregation of neuronal cell bodies. So basically a big cluster of neuron cell bodies that all happen to be kind of close together. Now, we have two different words that we use for this. So if that cluster of cell bodies is located in the central nervous system, we call it a nucleus. So remember, we talked about the basal nuclei in the brain. So those are just big collections of neuron cell bodies that are all packed together tightly. If we find the same structure in the peripheral nervous system, we do not call it a nucleus. We instead call it a ganglion. The other thing to be aware of is a big bundle of neuron axons. So if you kind of imagine taking the axons of many, many different neurons and kind of twisting them all together to form a big bundle, then again, we have two different terms that we use for that. If one of those occur in the brain, we call it a tract. Otherwise, if it occurs in the peripheral nervous system, we call it a nerve. Now, this one in particular is going to be a little bit tricky for us because the word nerve is something that you've been hearing your whole life, even before you really started studying science, right? So you're going to kind of have to fight this temptation to call everything a nerve, even bundles of axons that occur in the central nervous system. But you have to fight that temptation and do your best to call it a tract when it's in the central nervous system and a nerve when it is in the peripheral nervous system. Now, let's back up just a second. Go back to that term nucleus. So the nucleus referred to a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system. And this is what is kind of annoying and limited about the English language. We use the same word to describe three completely different things. So that's the fault of the English language, but we're going to have to work through it. So this picture that you're looking at right here shows you the three different types of nuclei that we have talked about up until this point. So I just want to make sure that you understand the difference between the three. In Chapter 2, we talked about an atom's nucleus. So any given atom, whether it's hydrogen or helium or sodium or potassium or oxygen, every atom has a nucleus. This is the region where you find the protons and the neutrons, right? That's one type of nucleus. The other type of nucleus that we talked about in Chapter 3 is a cell's nucleus. This is the membrane-bound organelle in which we store the genetic material, the chromosomes. It's where transcription takes place, RNA synthesis. That is another type of nucleus, and it is not the same thing as an atom's nucleus. Finally, the third type of nucleus that we've mentioned is a nucleus in the brain or a nucleus in the spinal cord. These are clusters of whole cell bodies, whole portions of cells that congregate together. So none of these three types of nuclei are the same as the others. They're all three completely different things, but unfortunately we use the same word to describe all three of them. So just want to make sure that you understand the difference here. So if we want a little bit of practice at using the terminology nerve versus using the terminology tract, look no further than this example right here. So we're looking down in a bird's eye view at the brain, and we're looking at the pathway of information that leads from the eyes to the back of the brain, which is called the occipital lobe, where visual information is processed. So something like this is something that we will talk about more fully when we get to Chapter 14 on the somatic nervous system and sensory physiology. All you need to focus on here is follow the pathway of information. So here are your eyes. There's your left eye. There's your right eye. I guess I should correct myself. If this is the left eye, this is not a bird's eye view. This is actually a bottom-up view, so pardon me. So if this is your left eye and that's your right eye, in blue and orange here, we see pathways of information leading from the retina, which is where the photoreceptors are located, the cells that absorb light and transmit that into an electrical signal that our brain can process and turn into an image for us to perceive. So the reason why there is a blue and an orange pathway here is because the retina is split up into a nasal retina, which in the left eye here is in orange, and in the right eye here is in blue, and then a temporal retina, which is the retina on the outside. So those pieces of information are treated slightly differently, but don't worry about that too much just yet. Like I said, we can focus on that in chapter 14. So just follow the information here. So the pathway that comes out the back of the eye is what we call the optic nerve. So the optic nerve is, again, just a big bundle of neuron axons, specifically neurons called retinal ganglion cells. These are just big pathways, big bundles of axons that exit out the back of the eye. Now, immediately after exiting the eye, we are still in the peripheral nervous system. We have not quite gotten into the brain yet. So that's why we use the term optic nerve here. But look what happens once we actually get into the brain proper. We stop calling it the optic nerve, and we instead start calling it the optic tract. So perfect example of how using the correct piece of terminology actually provides a lot of context and a lot of information so that you can give someone accurate and good information just by what term you choose to use. And like I said, the specifics of a pathway like this, don't worry about it right now. We will cover this more fully when we get to chapter 14. So let's talk some functions of the nervous system, which this really shouldn't be terribly new information for you by now if you've been kind of paying attention up until this point. So one responsibility of the nervous system is in sensation. So being able to perceive changes in our external and internal environment. We've talked about this plenty with regards to homeostasis, right? So the idea here is that we've got specialized types of neurons called sensory neurons, which are going to act as our sensors in a lot of different neural reflexes. These sensory neurons can be activated by things like changes in temperature, light in the case of photoreceptors, changes in pressure, and things of that nature. And when they are stimulated by these things, they transmit afferent information, so they fire action potentials through their axons, and that carries the afferent signal to the brain or to the spinal cord, whichever one is going to be our control center here. So after that comes integration. So once we get that information delivered to our control center, cells and nuclei within the brain or the spinal cord will receive that incoming afferent information and process it to decide on what is going to be the appropriate response. If our blood pressure drops, the brain is going to have to decide, okay, what do we do to get it back up, right? And then finally, the response. So the nervous system basically in a neural reflex is responsible for everything from the sensor all the way up to the effector and the response, getting the information to the effector so that we can get the response. So effector cells are not actually going to be part of the nervous system, but as I was indicating, the nervous system is tasked with getting the information, that efferent information, delivered to the effector effectively, right? So these effectors are going to be skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glandular tissue if you're talking about a temperature response where you need to sweat. So those cells in the brain and the spinal cord need to send that efferent information back out to the periphery so that we can get our response to occur. Now here's a nice little roadmap that kind of shows you where everything is located in the context of everything that we've been talking about so far. There's a lot of information here, and you're going to see kind of a splitting up of information, kind of categorizing things as to whether it is somatic or autonomic, and that's something that we'll briefly mention on the next slide. But the somatic and autonomic nervous systems are not anything we're going to look into specifically until we get to chapters 14 and 15. So speaking of which, let's talk about those divisions of the nervous system. What do they mean? So the somatic nervous system is responsible for basically everything that you are consciously aware of, whether it is voluntary contraction of your skeletal muscles, your ability to move your arms, move your legs, and move your body around, or if you're not talking about that, you're talking about your conscious perception, your ability to sense the environment around you and be consciously aware of that and turn that into motor responses. So the things you see, the things you hear, the things you taste, the things you feel, and the things you smell, right? So this will be the major focus of chapter 14. So not only will we talk about how do we get information to our skeletal muscles, we'll also talk about how do we, on the afferent side of things, how do we perceive the things we taste, or the things we smell, or the things that we see, or the things that we hear. So on the other hand, the autonomic nervous system is going to be responsible for all the things that we are not consciously aware of. Things that have to happen in our body, things that happen automatically without our really conscious perception of it for the sake of maintaining homeostasis. Things like our blood pressure, our oxygen delivery, things that thankfully we don't actually have to focus on ourselves. Our body takes care of these things for us. So these types of responses will usually involve the activation of glandular tissue, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and this is going to be the major focus of chapter 15. So we will definitely talk about these things in good time. So some examples might be the vasoconstriction and vasodilation that we've talked about to shunt blood flow from one tissue to another, your ability to dilate or constrict your pupil with your iris to adjust how much light enters your eye, the sweating mechanism for regulating your temperature, changing your heart function for delivering blood to needy tissues. So those will all be things that we talk about in chapter 15. So something that we probably won't get to talk about is the enteric nervous system, which... what the heck is the enteric nervous system? So this is kind of an interesting part of the nervous system that kind of almost exists outside of both the central and the peripheral nervous system. It's almost like a nervous system in and of itself. So these are ganglia and nerves that help to control the smooth muscle and glandular tissue of the digestive tract. So if we back up here, you can actually see the enteric nervous system kind of localized down here within the gut. So basically, since we're not going to get to talk about it a lot of what the enteric nervous system does is it helps to push digested materials along in response to sensing new undigested material coming in. It's what's called a vagovagal reflex. Basically, a lot of the reason why you kind of feel like you have to use the bathroom immediately after eating something is because your enteric nervous system sensed that new food coming into your digestive system, and it responded by using smooth muscle to push that digested material more along the large intestine further along. So, like I said, we probably won't get to talk about that a whole lot in this class, just because of time constraints. All right, so that is going to do it for this particular video. Go ahead and join us next time, and we will start talking about the neuron itself. We're really going to start dissecting what it is about a neuron that makes it capable of sending electrical messages. So thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.